Okay, here we go. All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome again to the Policy and Advocacy for Food Systems Change Training, which is hosted by the Wallace Center's Food Systems Leadership Network. I'm Annalena Kazikis, and I work with the Wallace Center to help coordinate the FSLN. Today, we're joined by Leah and Gabrielle Blavatsky with Equity Advocates for session 1 of this training on advocacy to build an equitable and sustainable food system. Political advocacy is one of the most effective ways of achieving lasting change in our communities and in the food system and in our respective food systems. As Wallace Center staff, as coordinators of this national network, and as just people doing food systems work ourselves, the last several years have really highlighted how vital policy is to food systems work and to creating the systems change that we're all working towards. And full disclosure, we're a little new to policy work ourselves. So while this is a super exciting field to enter into, can feel a little difficult, intimidating, and opaque to navigate. So we hope that, through this series, we can really demystify and debunk some of the myths that are surrounding advocacy work and use this to help strengthen our collective knowledge and collective power for tapping into policy as this incredible tool for long-lasting and real change. So we're excited to learn alongside you all throughout the series and to bring some of what we learned back into our work. So big thank you to Leah and Gabrielle for joining us today and for sharing your knowledge with us. I know we're all eager to dive in, but real quickly, just a super fast tech overview here. So I think, so this is being delivered on Zoom, and everyone will join the call muted and with video off. If you're having trouble with your audio, you can head down to the bottom left of your toolbar, and there's a little caret there next to your headset icon, and you can see the option to join with computer audio. That's generally your best bet. I will be here for helping troubleshoot some tech, so feel free to message me directly. You're also seeing the chat box, which you all are still using. I love that. So please feel free to share reflections, comments, and engage with each other throughout the webinar. There's also a Q&A toolbox. Feel free to use that instead of the chat for specific questions. Not sure we're going to get through to a Q&A today, but we will have office hours on Thursday to really dig into some of the stuff that's come up over today and tomorrow. So as I mentioned earlier, this training is hosted by the Food Systems Leadership Network. The FSLN is a national peer learning community of people and organizations and communities across the country that are all working towards more just, equitable, and sustainable food systems. So we create opportunities for food systems leaders to connect with each other, to learn from each other, to tap into a bunch of different resources to really help them become more effective in their work, whether it's mentorship, retreats, topical calls, and different trainings such as this one. So we will send out a link after the call for you guys to join if you haven't already. It's a really great space to crowdsource and build solidarity with people across the country doing this work. All right, so today's webinar is part of a series of trainings and conversations that are going to take place over the next month, all centered around policy. This week, we're joined by Equity Advocates, and on April 20th, we'll hear from the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition for a rundown on the Farm Bill. Then later in May, we're going to be hosting a panel with folks who've been engaged in policy work for a while to learn or to hear about their learnings, their challenges, and their advice for the road ahead. So we'll send out follow-up information with all of this in case you haven't seen it already. And with that, I'm going to stop talking and hand it over to Leah and Gabrielle to introduce themselves and begin the training. So thank all of you guys for being here today, and thank you both, Leah and Gabrielle, for walking us through policy. You're muted.
Of course, always, right? Thank you so very much. We are really pleased and honored to be able to partner with the Wallace Center on these series of advocacy and policy workshops. So really appreciate you all introducing yourselves in the chat. Please continue to share who's on the line today. But we wanted to introduce ourselves. So I am Leah Eden. I'm the Grassroots Advocacy Director and co-founder of Equity Advocates. And I'm joined today by my other co-founder, Gabrielle Blavatsky, and our Policy Director. So Equity Advocates is a nonprofit that launched in 2019. And our mission is to fight the underlying causes of food inequity through policy and systems change. And we do this work by partnering with New York-based nonprofits and community groups that are working to alleviate hunger and poverty. And we provide them with the tools they need to be really incredible advocates. So that ranges from policy education to advocacy training and coalition leadership. And as an organization and as advocates ourselves, we believe that access to healthy, affordable food is a basic human right. At the same time, we understand that structural racism has been a central driving force in our food system, both historically and today. And this knowledge really guides the development of our organization's our strategy, our decision-making processes, our policy priorities, and our coalition work. So we seek to advance policy solutions that are anti-racist to address the systemic causes of hunger. And when we think about how we're engaging in that advocacy, we're also trying to disrupt the inequitable power dynamics that can show up in today's policymaking process so that those who are most impacted by food insecurity can be the ones who are driving policy solutions and driving those policy conversations. So our organization's, our program structure and our advocacy is purposefully designed to center the voices of community leaders and practitioners who've been traditionally disenfranchised from that policymaking process. And so what that looks like is us actively recruiting, supporting, connecting, and organizing those most impacted by food inequity to ensure that they not only have a seat at the policymaking table, but that they're actually leading our own advocacy work. So as an organization, we do not speak on behalf of our community partners. We do not act as their lobbyists. And this is, in large part due to the fact that before we launched, we held over 90 different conversations with food systems practitioners and nonprofit leaders. And we heard clearly that what they wanted from us, what they needed from us, was to act as a backbone organizer and facilitator of their own advocacy work. And so, Gabrielle and I are working to leverage our privilege, our political access and experience to make the policymaking process more transparent and equitable. And so we wanted to share this so that going into the presentation, you understand and have a real clear sense of how we try to approach our advocacy with a racial equity framework. So our goals today are to introduce you to the power and the need for advocacy, including why community leaders and food systems practitioners like yourself can and should be at the policymaking table. We're going to explore the broad range of advocacy activities that nonprofits can engage in to influence public policy. We'll define and differentiate these different strategies, and we'll talk a little bit about and help you think a little bit about how different approaches might work for you as an organization. So just some quick housekeeping. These slides, this recording will be shared out with the audience afterwards. Again, as was mentioned, really encourage you to use the Q&A function to ask questions throughout the presentation. We might clarify in the moment, and then we'll likely hold for our office hours later in the week. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Gabrielle to give us some big picture overview of what advocacy is.
Hi, everyone. I'm Gabrielle Blavatsky, Policy Director at Equity Advocates. And yeah, I'm excited to dig into this topic with you today. So let's start with this big, broad question of what advocacy is and why food systems nonprofits should engage in it. Next slide, please. So the word advocacy can mean a lot of different things to different people. Often folks use advocacy and lobbying interchangeably, but they're not the same thing. Advocacy simply means expressing an opinion on an issue and sharing it with someone who has the power to bring about policy and systems change. And advocacy encompasses a really big, broad range of activities, and Leah is going to take a deep dive into what each of those are in the next section of this presentation and really flesh them out and explain what they are. So why should you as a food systems leader and or nonprofit leader advocate? Well, I just want to build a little bit on what Annalena was saying at the beginning about why it's really important for you guys as CBO leaders and people who work in the food system space, often in programming, to engage in this type of work. Many of us have organizational missions that focus on achieving long-term community and systems level change. But unfortunately, from Equity Advocates' perspective, the reality is that we're really not going to solve or address the underlying causes of hunger and poverty and healthy food inequity just through direct service programs. More often than not, achieving those goals is really going to require public policy change and systemic change. Advocacy can also help bring about additional funding and resources from government necessary to scale successful existing programs and solutions, and or improve the implementation of existing government programs that you may administer. Advocacy can also be a way to create completely new funding streams and policy solutions to support pilot programs and innovative solutions to the problems that you may be seeing on the ground or in your community or with your organization's work that you're doing. Advocacy can also help raise public awareness of an issue and to shift the power dynamics in the policymaking process. By engaging in community organizing work, helping to inform your community about opportunities to get involved in advocacy, you can help make the policymaking process and ideally the investments and resources that government is directing more equitable and inclusive. So, just to reiterate, getting involved in the legislative process is really not just an appropriate role for nonprofits to play, it's really critical. We've seen, Leah and I, both from working with policymakers and as advocates, that they really want to understand what's happening in their communities and for you to give them policy ideas and solutions in advance. Policymakers and their staff do not necessarily have the food or public health or nutrition background or expertise that you do. So they really need to hear from people like you. You are the subject matter experts on how these issues and programs and funding impact your community. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Leah to talk a little bit about advocacy strategies.
Great, thank you. So what advocacy looks like in practice on the ground can be really different case by case. And so in this section, we're going to talk through different advocacy strategies, also called tactics, that can usually work together to build out an advocacy campaign over time to create that lasting systemic change that you really want. Before we dive into strategies, I want to just launch a real quick poll. If you wouldn't mind going ahead and getting that out there. Just want to get like a pulse check. If you've engaged any of these following advocacy strategies, would love to get a sense of kind of where folks are coming today. So if you wouldn't mind.
I don't know if you can see it, Leah, but we do have the poll out and about 50% of people have answered right now. So I'm going to give it just a little bit longer. But looking like a pretty even spread so far, the most turnout around participating in coalitions in public education. But we're trickling up here.
Yeah, I get it one.
Cool. I can go ahead and close it. We have just about 80% of folks.
Great, thank you.
Let's share results.
Oh, great. Yeah, nice split there. It's good to see. So we've got some expertise at the table. We've got some folks that have dabbled in one, maybe a couple of these different ones. Great. All right, thank you. That's super helpful just to kind of get a sense of who's at the table. All right, so we are going to start with lobbying as our first advocacy strategy. And that's because there's a lot of misunderstanding around the distinctions between lobbying and advocacy, and specifically what this means for 501c3 nonprofits. So lobbying is an activity that's actually like very narrowly defined. According to the IRS, lobbying is an attempt to influence the passage, defeat, introduction, or change to a piece of legislation. And just to be a little confusing, the federal, state, and city governments each have their own definition of what legislation means. But broadly at the federal level, we are talking about a law, whether it's in Congress or your local or your state legislative body. We're talking about a public vote, like a referenda or a ballot initiative. Legislation would also include a constitutional amendment or trying to influence the president's either signature or veto of a bill. There are two different kinds also. So direct lobbying is an attempt to influence legislation by expressing your view on that legislation directly to a legislator. So for example, you see in this bottom photo here, one of our community partners, Equitable Schoolyard, New York City, they invited their representative for a site visit to see one of their school gardens to learn about farm to school programming. And while he was there, they asked him to, successfully asked him to co-sign a federal bill to increase funding for farm to school. That is direct lobbying. Grassroots lobbying, on the other hand, is an attempt to influence a specific legislation by encouraging the public or your members, folks in your network, to contact their own legislators about that legislation. So again, for example, if Equitable had posted on social media or sent a newsletter out to their network, encouraging their members to call their representatives and asking them to co-sign that bill, that would be grassroots lobbying. And lobbying can include different kinds of tactics. So it could be a site visit or a pretty traditional one-on-one meeting with a policymaker like you see on the other image. It can also include sign-on letters or social media campaigns targeting legislators. There's also a widespread misperception that 501c3 nonprofits cannot lobby. That is not true. Nonprofits can in fact lobby. There are just some IRS limits to how much you can do, both in terms of how much time and how much resources or dollars you can put towards lobbying. And there are reporting rules that your organization would need to follow. Typically, each state and each city has their own set of regulations, and we can't get into all of that now, but we would really encourage you to either talk to your legal support or have some pro bono support. And we also recommend a national organization called Boulder Advocacy. They are a great national resource for helping nonprofits advocate and lobby legally. So they're at just boulderadvocacy.org, a great free resource for folks. Our next strategy is educating legislators. And this is a really key distinction. So simply because you're simply talking with an elected official about an issue or about your work does not automatically mean that you are lobbying, right? Like you as a practitioner, you as an advocate can share your experience. You can talk about the impact of your programs, what's working. You can thank elected officials for previous actions, previous votes on important pieces of legislation, or you can educate them on broad, social topics like the value of nutrition education, right? As long as you're not asking them to take a specific action on a specific piece of legislation, we're talking about education and not lobbying. So that's a really key distinction, I think, for folks to understand. Because it can often look like lobbying, right? So it could include what these one-on-one meetings, it could include site visits again. It could also be elected officials reaching out and asking you to share your expert opinion on an idea or a pending, a draft piece of legislation. there is really great power in you being seen as an expert resource for these policymakers, right? So, as Gabrielle mentioned, policymakers are very rarely experts on your issue. You are the expert on your issue. And so you can play a really key, really valuable role in educating them. As a good example, the images in the press that you see here are from another one of our community partners. The Bronx Impact Food Access Collective is a group of about 35 emergency food and support service providers in the Bronx. This past February, they invited Representative Jim McGovern, who is the co-chair of the House Hunger Caucus, on a walking tour of the South Bronx to see how community groups are fighting hunger at the local level. And so they toured and talked with folks from a local food hub, a variety of street food vendors, nonprofits, restaurants, grocery stores, right? To really hear and learn directly from community residents, so that these learnings could inform his efforts to get the White House to convene a conference on food and hunger. There we go. So advocacy is not just about influencing public policy. It can also be about influencing public opinion about policy. So public education can really include encouraging more widespread attention on a social issue, or educating the general public or your network, your members, on potential impacts of a policy. Again, as long as there is no specific recommendation on a position or an action. And we've seen advocates really successfully educate the public about policy issues through conferences, virtual town halls, a lot of traditional or social media. So maybe, op-eds like you see here about the value of providing free school meals to all. And this could also include sending educational communication to your own communities or your own networks, right? So you could send a newsletter to all the farmers markets, all the farmers at your farmers market with a summary of pending legislation about nutrition incentives that might impact them. Nonpartisan research is also a really valuable tool in developing an informed advocacy campaign. So if you are connected to an academic center, institution, if you have access to really great researchers, or if you have a really strong evaluation capacity, sharing that data out with your peers and specifically with policymakers can be a place for you to make a really valuable contribution to this work. So the next strategy is community organizing. And community organizing is very much about building power. It is about engaging and bringing people that are most impacted by an issue together to identify shared problems and solutions. And this can look like holding regular community meetings to educate and discuss about policy issues, or just raise up concerns or issues that are happening within a community. It can include door knocking or recruiting folks from a particular neighborhood or a particular population to come together. And like all the strategies that we're discussing today, the end goal is around creating lasting systemic policy change. But for community organizing, there is also a real kind of equal focus on a process that will build and distribute power more equally through a community. And so there's sort of two key pieces to this, to building power here. One is around creating open structures that are democratically controlled by people that are organizing. So what that means is that organizers really are working to facilitate democratic decision-making. There's more often collective or distributed leadership that shows up in meetings and campaigns that are centering community organizing. The other piece is around building leadership capacity of those who are most impacted by an issue. So this could be through education or advocacy training for folks that are involved in this. We've seen community organizers and organizations that really invest in this even run leadership, boot camp kinds of programs around policy and advocacy, so that those most impacted can be doing the leading. And so we wanted to highlight an organization called Green Guerrillas and the organizing that they've been doing this past year as a really good case study of community organizing and lobbying strategies sort of working hand in hand. So Green Guerrillas is a resource and an advocacy center for New York City community gardens. They were founded in the early 1970s. And last year, in anticipation of a new mayoral administration in New York, that has really stated its desire to make New York City a national leader on urban agriculture. They mobilized its Council of Gardeners, which is a group of individual gardeners. And they hosted a series of open listening sessions with community gardeners across the city. And that led to a community-driven process where over 45 individual gardeners helped to develop and deliver an open letter to the city's Parks Department with a series of policy changes that they wanted to see. Those gardeners then met with agency representatives to share the letter and invited them out to a town hall to listen to a broader swath of concerns and policy recommendations. And so that really opened the door to a partnership where they're working in partnership with the agency to advance these recommendations. And so I think that's a really nice example of how community organizing raised up solutions identified by community members themselves to policymakers. Our next strategy is coalitions. And I was really glad to see that a lot of folks on the line have participated or engaged in coalitions in the past. A coalition is really a group of like-minded organizations or people who have a shared goal and commit to work collaboratively to create policy change. I think we've all heard like power is in numbers, right? It's a cliche for a reason. It works. And coalitions are really a powerful way to advance collective advocacy for a series of reasons. One, they bring together stakeholders to build agreement around what kind of specific change is required, right? So it's a space to discuss potential solutions. Maybe we need more funding or a new law or a change to the rules of a program. But it can be really confusing to policymakers if advocates across the space are asking for different kinds of things or asking for different kinds of solutions. So coalitions create a space to like get on the same page and really ask for what we want in a unified voice. It is also a space to build broader political support for an issue. This is especially true if you have voices from different sectors working together. So, maybe you have coalition stakeholders from education and hunger working together, or the environment and labor working together. It shows that there is this broader public support and more pressure for an issue. It can also be really attractive to a policymaker if you can say, hey, I've got this coalition of 70 plus organizations who are ready and willing to show up at your rally, or ready to show up in support of your bill, right? It looks really good from a policymaker's perspective as well. And then finally, coalitions are a space to really share advocacy resources, whether this is like insider policy intel, contact information for policymakers, data, right? It means that we can work together so that every coalition member does not have to go it alone, doesn't have to recreate the wheel or do every piece of an advocacy campaign themselves. So coalitions are a really efficient way to engage in advocacy, but it also means that organizations that are maybe newer to advocacy or don't have quite as much time and resources to engage in this work can join collective efforts and make a really powerful contribution to advocacy in this way. We at Equity Advocates are huge proponents of coalitions. And so we always really encourage, if you see a problem, if you want to get something changed, reach out to other organizations that are working on this issue, see if they're see if they're seeing the same thing. maybe there's an existing advocacy effort that you can join, or at least you can build something really powerful together. So we have walked through a variety of advocacy strategies to create systemic change. We also want to take a moment to acknowledge that structural racism and other forms of oppression can show up in advocacy and can show up in our advocacy strategies, just like other systems or institutions, right? So whether it's power dynamics between white-led organizations and BIPOC-led organizations, or power dynamics between stakeholders in a coalition, or even between policymakers and advocates themselves, we want to really pay attention to the way that these power dynamics may show up in our advocacy work. At Equity Advocates, we don't have all the answers for sure, but we wanted to share some ways that we think about centering equity in our advocacy strategies. And we also want to recognize that we have 171 participants on the line today, and there's a lot of expertise here. So would encourage you to use the chat to raise up other thoughts or approaches based on your own experiences. So first for us, we really think about building advocacy strategies that are centering BIPOC leadership. So that might look like coordinating our campaigns or supporting campaigns already existing in partnership with BIPOC-led groups, really taking a hard look around at who is leading a campaign, whether that's internally or publicly as spokespeople, right? And who has decision-making power within a campaign. We also try to be really purposeful about creating structures and processes so that directly impacted community voices are both informing the policy solutions that we're advocating for, our priorities, right? But also how that advocacy happens. So are your networks or your members directly informing your policy platforms, which priorities you're putting forward? And are they involved in and leading the conversations about which of these strategies we just talked about make the most sense and should be pursued? I think often we might see community voice show up or being kind of brought in at like the end stage of an advocacy campaign, maybe to tell a story or to share a quote with a policymaker or for social media. And I think we all know that storytelling can be extraordinarily powerful. It's a really crucial piece of this advocacy work, but it can also be extractive or like a tokenizing experience. And so we try to think about inviting community members and folks in our coalitions into every phase of the advocacy process as decision makers, so that when they are sharing their expertise, their experience, right, their story, they're doing so with dignity and with agency. And we've found sometimes that community members might need some additional supports to help do this, whether that is advocacy training or additional compensation or public speaking supports. I think these are all really worthwhile investments. And then finally, trying to be really thoughtful about creating inclusive and accessible advocacy activities and materials. So at the beginning and in the midst of advocacy campaigns, taking a look around and thinking about who is excluded from being part of this advocacy work and what can we do to counter that. So are you investing in language and readability tools to make sure that your meetings, your coalition meetings, or your strategy meetings, your public events, your materials are accessible? Are you using simple language and like spelling out acronyms, spelling out the names of these programs with 12 words in them, so that people don't feel excluded from a conversation that is really filled with wonky policy lingo? Are your coalition meetings and community events held in spaces and at times when folks feel comfortable and safe attending? Do you have childcare, food, compensation, right? Like all of these things go a really long way towards making somebody feel included or excluded from the process of Advocacy. And so just encourage people to continue sharing some of their thoughts on this as well throughout the remainder of the presentation. So now I want to shift back over to Gabrielle to help us think a little bit about how we put these strategies into practice.
Thanks, Leah. So how do we implement these different strategies? So there's a lot of different ways we can, and there's a lot of different places we can target these strategies to. Because policy change really happens within all different branches of government. And therefore, depending on our policy goals, we can and should direct advocacy and these strategies to one branch or all of them potentially. We can engage in advocacy with the executive branch, like the White House, the governor, or the mayor's office, as well as the agencies that they control that administer those programs. Or the legislative branch, like Congress in Washington, or your state legislature or your city council, or the judicial branch, which is the court system. To be an effective advocate, though, it's really important that you understand which branch of government is responsible for implementing the changes that you desire or the problems that you're seeing on the ground. It's also really important to know what level of government is responsible for making the changes that you want to see. So are we talking about, is this a federal government problem? Is this a state government problem? Is this a city government problem? And which one of them has the responsibility and the resources to make the change that you want? So there are 4 broad forms of advocacy to target these different branches of government, and I'm gonna get into them in depth with you guys. There's legislative advocacy, there's budget advocacy, there's regulatory advocacy, and there's legal advocacy. And who you're targeting and what types of changes are possible and what kind of advocacy activities or strategies are the most effective are all going to completely change based on the type of advocacy you're engaging in, what branch of government you're targeting, and really what your policy goals are. We're going to review each of them and share a few examples too. So we're going to start with legislative advocacy, which includes efforts to influence the introduction, repeal, and modification of legislation. Legislative advocacy, from what you remember from earlier in the presentation, is more often than not going to be lobbying. It includes everything from influencing lawmakers' votes on legislation, helping them write new legislation, or making changes to existing laws or programs. It's fine to do, you just need to track it. So here is an example of how Equity Advocates has engaged in legislative advocacy in the past. So we learned that our city council was working on a bill to establish a New York City Office of Urban Agriculture. And we got a hold of a copy of legislation that was going to establish this office. And we took that back to our alliance, our New York City Food Policy Alliance, the coalition that we facilitate. And we talked over with them the draft of the bill. We got their feedback. And then we collected all that feedback and relayed it back to the city council and the speaker's office who leads the city council for how we really thought that the bill could be improved and what we wanted to see with this office, like how we thought it should be set up. We also rallied our coalition members to put pressure on the city council through meetings and testimony at hearings to ensure that this bill included language requiring the city to establish an urban agriculture working group made up of farmers and practitioners that would help shape policy and funding decisions for the new office to really make sure community voice was involved in the office and it would work in partnership with its director. We were also successful as a coalition in getting the bill passed and putting pressure on City Council to pass it. And now we and our coalition of advocates are really focusing this year on implementation of this law and what, setting this office up and what it will do in practice now. Ultimately, the reason that we were able to do this, and we were able to engage in this legislative advocacy, successfully, is because we have good relationships with those policymakers and elected officials. They trust us, they trust the coalition. These are relationships that we have at Equity Advocates and our coalition of advocates have built over years and years, and now they see us as a resource. And we really recommend that if you haven't started building relationships with your elected officials, you start working on that this year. And fortunately for you, we have a whole training on how to do that tomorrow. And we hope that you will join us for that. Next slide. So another type of advocacy is budgetary advocacy, which includes efforts to influence decisions about how public money will be spent and allocated to government programs. We really believe that budgets should be a moral document, and they should ensure that public money is invested in the priorities of your organization and your community and policy solutions that you feel are important. Every year, there is a budget that's passed at every level of government, the federal, the city, and the state level, which are technically bills or pieces of legislation that allocate public dollars towards government programs, services, and government agency operations. You can, target elected officials through budget advocacy campaigns about what you want to see funded in those budgets, either through direct lobbying efforts or community organizing and coalition-led grassroots advocacy efforts, public education efforts like media and PR campaigns. There's a lot of different strategies you can use to influence the budget. Because in this type of advocacy, you're asking a policymaker to make a change to legislation that includes funding for programs and policies, even if it's just for your organization, it is considered lobbying and it does need to be tracked. So if you're going to engage in budget advocacy, it's important to get to know the key budget decision makers at whatever level of government you're targeting, the city, state, or federal level. These are often the heads of budget and finance committees in the legislative branch and heads of appropriation subcommittees, as they control the purse strings and usually are the ones that write the budget legislation. And you can look this up on whatever government website in whatever city or state you're in. They'll have the committee listings and the chairs of those committees, and you'll know who to target from there. However, ultimately, the final decision maker on the budget is controlled by the executive branch, like the president or the governor or the mayor, and they can also be really great targets for your budget advocacy campaigns as well. Budget cycles also have built-in advocacy opportunities, which are public hearings where you can offer testimony, opportunities to educate elected officials on budget negotiation teams are often called, the groups of legislators that are the ones that do the final bill writing and discussion. And also opportunities to engage the public and educate them about what's in the budget, how it impacts them, and why they should get involved and engaged. Budget cycle calendars that include key decision timelines and hearing opportunities are often listed again on the city, state, and federal government websites wherever you're living, and can be important tools to help you organize your budget and advocacy campaign timelines. That's what we do at Equity Advocates, and it's just a really great way to kind of structure your campaign. We have on the slide here an example of budget advocacy. So National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, which is an amazing organization who will be speaking with this group next week. So they engage very heavily in budget advocacy. And here's an example of their efforts to influence the fiscal year 22 omnibus appropriations bill passed by Congress a few weeks ago. It's a bill that includes discretionary funding for food and agriculture programs across the entire country for the year. And they organize their community of farmers and food systems practitioners to identify what budget priorities they had, and then use those priorities to engage in both direct lobbying with elected officials on Capitol Hill, as well as grassroots advocacy efforts with their farmers to talk about what was important to them in the bill and what they wanted to see funded through this bill. And here they tweeted out a statement about what made it into the bill and how they felt the bill fared at the end, with a statement from their policy director to really educate the public about, whether or not they felt the bill was good or bad, and what they felt about the investments that were made through the bill. So all different ways and strategies to influence the budget. Next slide, please. So there's also legal advocacy, which is litigation advocacy that uses the judicial system to advance social change. This is often the last line of defense used by advocates to stop a law that's already been passed from being enforced. It's very expensive and time consuming and form of advocacy and requires very specific legal expertise. So not all groups can really engage in this type of advocacy. When it's done, it's typically done in partnership with large national legal advocacy groups like NRDC or ACLU. You guys may remember that under the last administration, a rule was put in place that prevented certain immigrants to the US from obtaining visas if they had limited financial resources and were likely to become what's called a public charge. Immigration experts at the National Immigration Law Center filed a lawsuit to challenge this rule and delay its implementation. That was an example of legal advocacy. And ultimately, however, the presidential election happened and the new administration stopped the law from being implemented. But that this is a pathway if you want to use it. The final one we will talk about, final strategy, is regulatory or administrative advocacy. So often laws developed by the legislature are really short and lacking on a surprising amount of detail. And once a law is passed, the agency that's responsible for implementing it really has to develop rules and regulations about around how to enforce the law and fill in all the details that impact really what the law will look like in practice. And while the rules aren't law in the same sense, they do hold power and they have a lot of impact on the ground, especially for CBOs often. And as a CBO, you can engage in an unlimited amount of regulatory advocacy on the federal level. It's not included in your lobbying time or your money limits. And these types of activities can include submitting public comments directly to a federal agency during an open comment period, following the release of a proposed rule in what's called the Federal Register, which is an online website where the government publishes all of the different rules they have open. And you can look at them and comment on them right there on that website. Regulatory advocacy can also include working directly with agency officials and meeting with them to talk about how you think they should change existing programs and how they're administered. You can work with them to change and develop RFPs that the agency may put out, requests for proposals, for government contracts, or work with them to shape efforts and reporting requirements that agencies may have of government contractors, CBOs that have government contracts. You can also work with state or city agencies to help shape their applications for waivers or grants to the federal government. Did anyone here engage in regulatory advocacy during the Trump administration around changes that they wanted to make to the SNAP program or changes they wanted to make to nutrition standards for meals? There were a lot of opportunities to engage in regulatory advocacy under the last administration. If you did, please let us know in the chat. We'd love to hear from you. Since the Wallace Center has experience in this type of advocacy, we're actually going to hand it over to them to share some examples and learnings on their own about how they worked with USDA.
Yeah, thanks, Gabrielle. Hey, everybody, Susan here from the Wallace Center. And I think regulatory advocacy has been an area that we've been really active in the last couple of years, especially since the COVID pandemic hit and the USDA received something like $4 billion through the American Rescue Plan Act to build supply chain resiliency. And it was really up to the agencies at USDA, like Agricultural Marketing Service, to figure out what they were going to do to achieve the spirit of that bill. So like Gabby said, there really wasn't a whole lot of specificity as to what the funding was to be used for, and it was up to the agency to decide how to roll out programs that would then achieve that overarching goal of supply chain resiliency. So for example, over the last couple of years, as we learned about what the Agricultural Marketing Service was cooking up in terms of this new local food purchase assistance program or the regional food business centers and other strategies that they've been rolling out, we would find out about that, kind of get some of that intel that she was talking about. We would then pull together network leaders and other folks who are really involved in doing this kind of work on the ground, host listening sessions with them to really get insight, ideas, questions, etc., crowdsource those, compile the feedback, and then bring it back to AMS. And we've done that in a bunch of different forums. Some of you that are on the call I know have been involved in those. So that's one way in which the Wallace Center has been involved in some of that regulatory advocacy in this past year. Another way that we've done this is by really honing in on some of the specific grant programs that Agricultural Marketing Service administers, like the Local Food Promotion Program, Regional Food Systems Partnerships Program, of which I know many of you have grants through, and I just saw that question come through. AMS is the Agricultural Marketing Service of the USDA, so it's one of the divisions of the USDA. AMS administers some of those grant programs. Through our support to network members around accessing those programs, we learn a lot about what the challenges are with the application, with the outreach, with the information that AMS is sharing. And so we're able to sort of crowdsource that, compile the information, and send recommendations to the Agricultural Marketing Service on how they could improve the program, letting them know about some of the challenges that folks are having on the ground. And that's been really helpful to the folks at AMS. So maybe you can go to the next slide. I can just just share some of the kind of lessons learned that we've gathered from these strategies over the last 2 years. Is one of our partners, Kate Fitzgerald, has really emphasized how important it is to keep the information that we share with the agency very direct and very to the point. They don't want a whole lot of context. They don't want a whole lot of explanation. They want almost bullet points, frankly, of what the very direct recommendations are of the changes that they can make. I think also just really holding in mind that the folks that work in these agencies are really committed to the goals of the agency. And so the more that you can like kind of frame up your recommendations that are in line with what they're trying to do and really present yourself as an assistant, as a helper, as someone who is trying to help them achieve those goals through these recommendations, they're really going to embrace your partnership and your thought partnership. Which helps to build that relationship that that Leah was talking about earlier as well. And then I think, critically important here is really centering the leadership of the folks who these programs and policies are going to impact. So for example, when we hosted a listening session with the USDA recently, we had food hubs speaking for themselves about the changes that they need around school food regulation in particular, in order to be able to work with school food nutrition authorities more effectively. So we help to convene the space and to pull folks together, but then folks are really speaking for themselves and giving their own stories, recommendations, et cetera, to those, to the agency leaders that were in that space. So those are just a couple of examples from our work recently and some lessons learned. I'll hand it back to you. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you. That's a really great example of being able to build a trusted relationship with an agency. So you can kind of get in and make sure that the programs are as good as possible before they start, or have those open lines of communication to improve as needed. All right, so I hope that we have been really clear that there isn't a one size fits all model when it comes to advocacy. And in this section, we want to help you think a little bit about what approaches might make the most sense for your own organization when it comes to engaging in advocacy. So you may have heard of insider, outsider political strategies. These are not necessarily fixed types of advocates, but they're rather approaches that you might lean on for different reasons throughout an advocacy campaign. Insider tactics are intended to change policy through direct work with policymakers and other formal government institutions. So it's usually approaches that are more cooperative in nature, right? So it's sort of more what comes to mind when you think about working inside the system. It might be meeting with government officials, doing lobby days like you see here on the slide, working in partnership to develop bill language, or even participating in an advisory or a city working group that would develop recommendations for the administration. And we've seen this be real successful when there is a supportive administration, or maybe a policymaker who is a champion or already kind of interested or on your side of an issue. Maybe you have an advocate or a group that has an existing relationship with an elected official or has some close proximity and access to power. And so you have an open door to sort of work within the system. Outsider tactics is, on the other hand, more about creating external, purposefully public pressure on policymakers to make a change. And so it's more often seen as a bit confrontational in tone, maybe what comes to mind when you say activist methods, right? This could be social or traditional media that is calling out the government for its action or inaction. It could also be mass direct actions like rallies, protests, boycotts, demonstrations that are really designed to garner a lot of media and a lot of public attention. And these are approaches that you may end up taking when there's little political will or interest in a particular issue. It might be used by groups that don't have a close proximity to power, So meaning they might not have that same access to behind the closed doors negotiations. But it also can be a tactic that, that folks take when a insider strategy stalls or fails. So a great example of this outsider strategy is what you see here on the slide, the Street Vendor Project and its ongoing New York State campaign to decriminalize the street vending industry. They are a membership-based organization made up of New York City street vendors, most of which are owned and operated by immigrants and people of color. And so over the last week or so, they have been organizing a 24-hour sleep out and rally in front of our New York State governor's offices, really pushing her to pass 2 state bills to decriminalize the industry. And so as you can see here, they've really brought out folks in mass and have garnered a great deal of public pressure on her office. So using an insider-outsider strategy can really shift and change over the course of a campaign, and are not necessarily one or the other. They often work hand in hand. You can see these tactics shift when we have a new administration or a changing political realities. So the approach that food systems advocates took looked very different under the previous administration as it does under the Biden administration, for example. It also can shift based on the needs of a campaign, right? So you may start out with more of a partnership insider campaign and then have to lean on a more outsider approach if you're not making any progress. And a really great example of that is the campaign that you see on the slide here. It's a campaign led by the community food advocates that led a campaign to get New York City to offer free school meals for all. They started with a very insider approach, really building public champions with our borough presidents and public advocate and city council. And when they hit a wall with our mayor, that those insider tactics weren't working anymore, they really shifted to more of an outsider tactic approach and started to hold more rallies and have more student-written op-eds that were really critical of the mayor not investing in this. And so they were ultimately able to be successful in pushing this campaign forward using these strategies hand in hand. And I think the final thing to keep in mind in terms of how to approach your advocacy is that groups engage in advocacy at different levels. And it is often a matter of how closely connected you are to an issue, as well as what kind of capacity you have to engage in this advocacy. And so if there's an issue that is very mission aligned and you have a great deal of expertise and a lot of resources, you might really take a leadership role and have a real ownership over a campaign. That could look like developing a policy platform, leading campaigns, meeting with all of the New York State, representatives at once. If you don't have as much capacity, you can really contribute or endorse a campaign. And that might look more like participating in a coalition, supporting other activities, maybe meeting with a single target elected official that you have a real relationship with and have some sway. Or if you are very new to advocacy, don't have a great deal of capacity, you can really follow and support others. And that could be as simple as signing on to a petition, letter, or platform, or even retweeting a social media campaign. And I think we would really want to leave you with the knowledge that advocacy is a team sport. And so no matter your capacity or what you can bring to the table, you likely have something to contribute. And so we really hope that today's session has shown you some ways to do just that. And we hope you continue to join us in future sessions.
So that concludes our presentation today, guys. Thank you so much for coming. We really hope you come to tomorrow's session on best practices and how to meet with elected officials to really go over the nitty-gritty of how to meet with and facilitate meetings with elected officials and build relationships with them successfully. We are also going to be holding office hours where we hope you will bring all of your questions that you've developed over the course of this presentation. We look forward to talking with you there. The office hours will be held on the 7th, 1 p.m. Eastern, 12 p.m. Central, 10 a.m. PST. So be there. And we will also be sending around a evaluation survey after this. We really hope that you take it. It helps us make our work and presentations and trainings that we do like this at Equity Advocates stronger. So yeah, we'd really appreciate if you would just take a moment to take that. And with that, I'll hand it over to the Wallace Center in case they want to say anything to close us out. And thank you to the Wallace Center for hosting us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, no, you wrapped us up fantastically. So thank you both for such an informative, resource-rich conversation and training. Really excited to jump back in tomorrow. So with that, thank you all for joining and have a wonderful rest of your day. We'll follow up with recordings, slides, and survey links. All right, thank you.